Hi, everybody. Welcome back to CMN 201. This is for our class for Wednesday, March 10th, where we are talking a little bit about Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And I also wanted to talk a little bit more about the final project and also talk about the 1960s. And I have to admit that when we get to the decade of the 1960s, I did a little bit of cheating. As you know, I've been trying to find a representative film for each of the decades that we've been talking about. And the 1960s have two films that I believe are equally important. So we've got two films to represent the 60s. The first being Psycho, which is what we are going to be watching for this class. And the second being Night of the Living Dead, which is what we are going to be watching for the next class. But where we left off last class was talking about Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And today, by the way, is when your third journal is due on Cat People. And I think we've put some closure onto Cat People. We talked a little bit about how incredibly nuanced that film really was compared to the films that we've seen thus far. And I think you can see a growing level of sophistication in the films as the films become more contemporary, as well as the layers of psychology and eroticism in that particular film. And we'll see something similar with Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And I had indicated that The Thing in 1951 was the film that was identified by one of our texts as perhaps being the most representative of the 1950s about the uncertainties of the future rather than concerns about the legacies of the past. And if you want to think about something like Cat People and the concern with the past that Irina has in the folklore of her people, or again with Dracula and his past, and how that ultimately is influencing his future. And even with Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, if it turns out that basically Francis is narrating this, he's narrating everything from the past perspective. But now we've got things that are firmly set into the future, which has led to some dispute about genres again, which is how we began the semester, and how do we differentiate horror from science fiction and from fantasy. And one definition that appeared in our text that I thought was interesting, that horror is the dread of knowing, as opposed to science fiction, which is the danger of a closed mind. And I'll let you sort of mull that over as we talk about a film that isn't The Thing, but that also can be put into the realm of science fiction, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which was based on a sci-fi novel that was called The Body Snatchers by Jack Finney. And you can see how many of the films that we've seen have corollaries with text. And obviously for a medium popular culture class, while our focus is on film, we also want to focus on other media vehicles, such as the importance of novels and just the importance of storytelling in general in terms of creating film. And we also are beginning to get films that are becoming more and more apocalyptic in nature. And many times it's been discussed that the reason why is because of the growing concerns of nuclear annihilation in the 1950s. The 1950s were a very troubled period. Certainly there were grave concerns about the atom bomb. This was the early Cold War and the possibilities of there being a World War III. And also a fear of invasion, whether it be through immigration or also the possibility of invasion from space. In 1948, supposedly there was a flying saucer crash in Roswell, New Mexico. And definitely there was concerns about government cover-ups and the fact that perhaps we needed to be more aware of our surroundings. And an Invasion of the Body Snatchers, I don't think it's any coincidence that the town that they're in is called Santa Mira, and because in Spanish, mira means to look. And basically what the film is telling us is to pay attention and look, to stay awake, if you will. I also don't think that it's a coincidence that when these characters fall asleep, that they become vulnerable. And in some ways, it reminds me of the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari as well, about the sense of hypnotism and being in an altered state in which you could manipulate somebody, that they aren't completely awake or aware, so they don't have as much agency as they normally would. Even something very small, a tiny detail, if you noticed on the town common street, the large stop that was written on the crosswalk. I mean, in some ways, it could be more than just a traffic signal. It's a message to us as audience to stop and become aware of the situation that we are experiencing, or at least that society was experiencing. It was a time of suburban flight where the home was seen as a kind of refuge, but the reality was that the home became a kind of prison. And socioeconomic class had a great deal to do with this suburban flight because it was oftentimes white flight away from urban areas into suburban areas. And the television has oftentimes been likened as a kind of electronic hearth, if you will. So if you think about a fireplace or a hearth that is supposed to basically draw our attention with the flickering flames, perhaps the television and its flickering screen is mimicking much the same. And in fact, there have been parallels that have been made with computer screens, and this is our contemporary modern hearth. But the communist threat, the idea that from a political perspective that America was vulnerable, was huge at this particular point in time, that other countries and other cultures were in effect planting seeds. And I use that term deliberately when we think about the pods in Invasion of the Body Snatchers against personal liberty. And what that would mean is that would dehumanize all of us, remove our individual agency, and remove basically our individuality. That said, there's a certain level of irony in the film that the Savior becomes one of the most authoritarian institutions that exists in law enforcement. So, in some ways, there's a paradoxical message. And in fact, the way the film was originally made, and this is something that we've seen with other films as well, that after test audiences have reviewed it, they've been changes made. We know that was the case with The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. It didn't originally have that opening and closing frame, and that opening and closing frame helps to soften some of the possible symbolism of Caligari representing this authoritarian German government once we start thinking about the unreliability of the narrator, which happens to be Francis. Though I've always thought that's what's interesting about Caligari is, despite the fact that Francis is insane, that doesn't in any way negate Caligari and how menacing he is and how threatening he seems to be. In other words, both can be possible at the same time. And perhaps it's because of people like Caligari or German authoritarian governments that individuals do become insane. But certainly when we see in this particular film is the original ending was supposed to be much more pessimistic, where basically Miles is on the highway. And again, you can see some possible symbolism there where he is trying to take the high way or the better way, the way of democracy. And he's trying to have individuals stop, and he's pleading for help. And that's how the film would have ended. It was viewed as too pessimistic, so we've got the ending where he goes to law enforcement, and then finally he's believed. It doesn't escape me that this is a film about humanity, and when he's in the highway yelling and screaming for help, no one stops. They may or may not necessarily have been taken over by pod people at this particular point in time, but we do know that they aren't necessarily showing empathy and care in terms of Miles when he's on the highway, or he's obviously distraught. It turns out he's not insane. He's quite sane, but certainly the first thought that most people would have is that this is a very troubled individual that is in need of help, and help doesn't come to Miles. It's also been noted that when the women who are the first to observe that there's something wrong, they are dismissed. It's only until the males, much like Miles, begin to acknowledge that there's something wrong that it has much more validity. So I think gender is important in this film, and gender dynamics, just like we talked about gender with cat people and how immediately Irina is dismissed. Would she have been dismissed as quickly if she were male? And how easily it would have been to institutionalize her if she wasn't necessarily acting within the societal confines and expectations of the time period. And that film can be read in so many ways, but this idea of the fear of intimacy in general and not just necessarily physical intimacy, but emotional intimacy is something that's embedded within that film. And in this particular film, I would say that embedded within it is the loss of humanity. And it doesn't have to be from, let's say, an outside force like communism. There's a very telling quote at the beginning of the film where there's speculation as to what's happening. And the idea is that there's some sort of mass hysteria that's being caused by worry about what's going on in the world, and how much could events in the world and all of the problems and fears associated with the 1950s result in a kind of catatonic state that leads to a loss of humanity. And in fact, some people have said that that's exactly what television has done, is that it's led us to have a kind of catatonic state so that we don't have to necessarily address the inequalities and the paradoxes and the hypocrisies of our society, that we're kind of lulled into a kind of stupor, almost hypnotized, if you will, or put asleep, if you will. But this sense of also double, which we've seen in just about all of the films that we've seen thus far, is also represented in this film. This idea of the doppelganger, or the double, the emotionless double here, and that double and that emotionless monster can be family, can be friends, can even be oneself. So the monster is everywhere, and there is no safety, and suburbia does not offer safety. So this idea of having suburban flight is really very empty, and it's something that we'll definitely examine in Psycho as well, that the dangers lurk literally everywhere, and no place is safe, not even a place where perhaps we're at our most vulnerable, which happens to be in the shower, when we are completely alone, and we are undressed and in our perhaps most vulnerable state. But as we continue on thinking about this particular film, I think it works very nicely with some of Freud's theories about the uncanny as well. And if you'll remember, we talked about how the uncanny is frightening and disorienting at the very least, because there are enough similarities to humanity and to ourselves that we can recognize ourselves within that, but yet there's something that's not quite right. There's something that's off in one way or another. And that's definitely what's being discussed in this particular film, is that these individuals look the same and act the same, but yet they're not the same, and they don't have the ability to experience love and emotion in the way that the other characters do. This particular film too, I think when we think about Becky Driscoll, she's a particularly interesting character. She is in some ways a rather sensual character, especially at the beginning when we see her with her strapless dress, which would have been considered rather risque. And certainly even Irina's behavior in Cat People, the fact that she invites a stranger into her apartment could even be seen as risque in contemporary times, but especially during her times. Becky is divorced, and so is Miles. So in some ways, that's very unusual for this particular time period. And there's a little bit of sexual innuendo that goes on between the two of them as they go about their dating as well. So what we see is basically a changing society. And if horror examines the anxieties and the fears of the world, then the fear of sexual liberation and the fear also of female empowerment were just as strong as communism, or space invasion, or World War III, or any of the other social political fears that were involved in that particular time period. McCarthyism and the paranoia that resulted because of McCarthyism, where everyone was a potential enemy and everyone was basically in one way or another capable of hurting another individual. I think it is something that also is embedded within the particular film. That said, I wanted to talk a little bit about the final project. As I had indicated earlier, your third journal is due today on Cat People. And basically throughout the rest of the semester, we will have journals due on the previous films that we've watched. And Eventually, there will be that final project where you can do some sort of an in-depth analysis. And while I'm encouraging you to use other forms of media, so if you wanted to write a screenplay, for instance, or if you wanted to shoot a short film, that's certainly a creative way that you could go about it. But I suspect that many of you will probably write the traditional academic paper. It's one of the reasons why English 101 is a prerequisite for this class. So the assumption is that you've gone through the process of how to write a paper. So I'm hoping this is review, but what I've included in the syllabus and other documents folder above is a handout that actually talks about writing a paper that I actually received myself when I was a college student. So it's got some age to it, and it's still yet one of the best handouts that I've ever seen in terms of the process of writing a paper. And it divides it up into 3 stages: the planning stage, the writing stage, and the editing stage. And I can tell you that most writers skip straight to the writing stage, and they run out of time, so there's no editing. In other words, they don't usually plan and they don't usually edit. So I'm encouraging you to go through the 3 stages, and that right now would be a good time for you to begin your planning stage, just to begin to think about what will you write about, what could you write about, and to generate ideas. And you don't have to worry about language, and that is, I think, one of the ways that writers oftentimes end up losing a lot of time, is that they're trying to write the perfect sentence. And you don't have to write the perfect sentence. Come up with your ideas first. It can be even in a list form. And then you can organize those ideas in the order in which you think you want to discuss them. Then you can begin to formulate sentences and paragraphs around them. It's usually a much more effective way for writing. And again, to make sure that when you're done with writing, that there's enough time and energy left so that you can actually review what you've done with the editing. So very briefly, and you can see that these are discussed in the handout, the introductory paragraph, your first paragraph, is where you give your thesis, which happens to be your main point. And if you are addressing a particular film or director or author or text, you would include that information in the introduction so that the reader is familiar with what it is that you are going to be discussing. Now, the thesis, the main point, is probably the trickiest part of writing, and you may not necessarily know what your thesis is when you initially begin. You might discover your thesis as the process continues. So I've had many students actually write the body paragraphs, reread what they wrote, summarize it in a sentence or two, and that is their thesis, which they plug into the opening. So they work backwards. So you could certainly do something like that as well. Your body paragraphs are basically meant for your evidence. This is where you're trying to convince the reader of your particular position, because your thesis is supposed to be taking a position upon which reasonable people could disagree. And you can think of the reader almost like a judge in a court of law, where basically they are reviewing the evidence that you are presenting. You could think of yourself as an attorney, if you will, presenting evidence. And then ultimately, your position has to be possible. It doesn't even have to be probable. It just has to be possible. That's the level of standard of proof you need to get at. And that means that there can be multiple papers with different positions, and they can all be equally valid. They can all be A papers if you present the evidence in order to be able to support it. So, and it's why so many attorneys actually begin as English majors, because the skills you use in terms of creating a thesis and defending it for a text are very similar to the kind of skills you would use in a courtroom, where you are gathering evidence for your client and then trying to put forth the case of innocence or guilt. And the way that you provide your evidence is through paraphrase and quotation. Paraphrase is when you are using your own language to explain the information that was in the text or the film, if you will. And quotation is a direct statement, word for word, and you would use quotation marks for that. And then you have a concluding paragraph, and that's where you give your closure, and that's where you find a way to end your arguments. You don't want to necessarily restate your introduction, but you also don't want to introduce a new idea. That would be in the conclusion. So a lot of times what you can do with the conclusion is perhaps relate what you are discussing to present day or to a related work. And you've got to remember that a paragraph is 3 or more sentences, so that although in journalism you'll oftentimes see 1 or 2 sentences, that you want to have developed paragraphs in the way that you would expect in academia or also in the world of business. So you need to have at minimum a beginning, a middle, and an end. So those are your 3 sentences. And that includes the conclusion, even though you might be out of ideas and energy by that particular point. And your paragraphs will probably be much longer than 3 sentences. 3 is the minimum. And the first sentence of your paragraph is called the topic sentence. And what it usually does, it usually summarizes what the paragraph is about. So if you were to go through your paper and read just your first sentences, what you should find basically is a kind of outline of what it was that you wrote. And then, of course, the sentence basically is there to express a complete thought. Each sentence should be able to stand on its own, so that when you're looking at the grammar of a sentence, you shouldn't need to depend on the previous sentences and the following sentences in order to make sense of that particular sentence. And punctuation, the marks that we use within a sentence are used to clarify meaning. So for instance, a comma would be a pause in places where we would usually pause to take a breath when we were speaking, or when we were paused to emphasize something. And again, different pieces of punctuation have different meanings. You think about something like the distinction between the period and the exclamation point and the comma, and how important punctuation is, ending punctuation, for a sentence like sit down. Because you can hear in my voice that when I say sit down, or when I say sit down, that I have very different meanings and emotions behind those. However, you can't tell that with the written sentence, sit down. But if I wanted to be read as sit down, well, then I would use a question mark. If I wanted to be read as sit down, that would be the exclamation point for the closing punctuation. And of course, the period would be the sit down, and usually that's what we use as closing punctuation. So you can think of punctuation as basically clues for the reader on how to go about reading a particular sentence. And I have a couple of websites that I can recommend to you in terms of grammar, mechanics, and also the construction of papers. And the first is Purdue OWL. You may have heard about this in other classes, and it was a website that was put out by Purdue University in terms of the process of writing, but they've made it accessible to everyone, and the website is below in the notes. And it's a wonderful site for looking up grammar, mechanics, and also the construction of papers, and quotation, how to document, which is something that I thought that we could talk about a little bit next class as well. In the event that you are going to be quoting, we use in the humanities the MLA system, or the Modern Language Association system. So I thought I could talk a bit about that next class. And also, our GCC library website is a wonderful website. Particularly, you can see that they've got, and the link that I've included is the writing and citation guides. And the citation guides are the guides you use for quotation. And there are different rules for different disciplines. So I had mentioned the MLA, which is what's used for the humanities. But you might be also familiar with the APA, or the American Psychological Association. That's used for the sciences. So you wouldn't use the rules of the APA for this class, even though that would be correct for, let's say, your biology class. Instead, you would use the MLA, Modern Language Association, for this class, but you wouldn't want to use the MLA for your biology class. And the thing about the rules is that you don't even necessarily have to memorize them. You just look them up the way you would in a guidebook, and you just follow the directions. And the intent is similar with all of the different citation guides, is that you are giving the reader enough information so that they can verify the veracity of that particular quote. And they probably wouldn't, but I still wanted you to be able to make sure that you are quoting correctly, because you never know if a reader is or is not going to be looking at the veracity of the quote. So in terms of the handout, I just wanted to very quickly say that this handout is about a critical paper, which means that the handout that I've put in the Syllabus and Other Documents guide is about writing a paper without using any outside resources outside of the original text that you are analyzing. You could certainly elect to write a research paper if you wanted to do so. A research paper is somewhat more complex because not only do you have to put together the analysis from other areas and other scholars, but you also have to include your own thoughts. I have no problems with a research paper either if that's what you wanted to do. That's one of the things you should be doing in your planning stage, is trying to figure out which way you wanted to proceed. Certainly, if you are going to write a research paper, you want to start gathering the materials earlier rather than later so that you aren't trying to write everything in the last minute. And you can see that the handout talks about with planning that you are analyzing and you aren't summarizing. So in other words, if you are talking about a film, you don't have to basically summarize the film in its entirety, just those pieces that are relevant for your particular analysis. Begin with a strong thesis that implies something interpretive. And you can see that the example they're using is for Hamlet, but it would work for any of our films as well. You don't want to say, in Hamlet, Shakespeare explores the complexities of experience. And you also don't want to say, in Psycho, Hitchcock explores the complexities of experience, because basically it's so vague, it says nothing at all. I would say that all artists explore the complexities of experience. Likewise, you wouldn't want to say that Shakespeare employs much imagery in Hamlet, or you wouldn't want to say that Dr. Caligari employs much imagery in its film, because ultimately, probably all pieces of art and literature employ imagery. What's more important is what imagery is used and why. That would be part of the thesis. And you can see that it talks about the importance of supporting your arguments. Think of me of taking the opposite viewpoint, in effect, and that you have to convince me, the reader, of that possibility. And then the writing piece. And the writing, and I wanted to read this to you, the first principle of good writing is economy, and the second is simplicity. Say as much as possible in as few words as possible. So basically, you should have enough time after you've constructed your paper so that hopefully you can set it aside and then you can go back to it with a fresh eye and look at your sentences and ask yourself, can I rephrase these sentences in fewer words and not sacrifice meaning? And if so, that's exactly what you want to do. And I know this can be painful because that means you're going to sacrifice length. But keep in mind that what's more important than length is argumentation. So I know that students like to get a guesstimate about length because that gives them an idea of how much time and energy that they should put into a paper. And I was suggesting something like 4 pages or so. But your paper should be, if you are writing a paper, as long or as short as it needs to be in order to support your thesis. I'd rather have a shorter paper that's well written than a longer paper that has a lot of unnecessary language. So when teachers are talking about length, they're usually talking about arguments. They're not necessarily talking about words per se. So that said, read your sentences and see if there are ways that you can make them more concise, which usually makes it a better reading experience. And use the active rather than the passive voice. And what that means is that you are clearly showing that the subject of the sentence is engaged in an action. The subject is who or what is doing the action. In other words, Lillian graded the journals. That's considered active because the subject of the sentence, Lillian, because Lillian is doing the grading, and grading is the verb, it's very clear that Lillian is engaged in the grading. So that's the active voice, and that would be considered to be preferable to saying, the journals were graded by Lillian. And in this instance, it's as if the grading were being done to Lillian, to the subject. It also is a longer sentence. The journals were graded by Lillian than Lillian graded the journals. So if you think about the idea of trying to be concise, this is a great example of how you can eliminate a couple of words without sacrificing meaning. And you end up with a stronger piece of writing. You should vary your sentences so you have some long ones and some short ones. Too many long ones, it's very dense. Too many short ones, it sounds very choppy. Vary your sentence beginnings so that all of the beginnings of your sentences aren't starting with the same word, especially if those sentences appear near one another or next to one another. Again, a paragraph is 3 or more sentences. Avoid cliches, which are overused expressions that really don't have any originality to them. So if you've ever heard of jealousy is that green-eyed monster, that is a cliche. So it's better to put in your own words. By the way, that cliche comes from Shakespeare. And when Shakespeare first wrote it, it was original. It wasn't considered to be a cliche. Or it wasn't considered to be trite. And many of our expressions actually come from Shakespeare. On a little side note, you may or may not realize that we, all of us are quoting from Shakespeare in one way or another. There's a whole host of expressions that he put in his plays originally that have become part of our common knowledge, such as jealousy's that green-eyed monster, or dead as a doornail, and lots of other possibilities. And also, you should be avoiding slang. Slang is informal language that is created by one group so that that language is not understood by other groups. It's what adolescents tend to do every generation as they create their own language. Sometimes slang does go mainstream. So, and that said, just because it goes mainstream, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's still not slang. It's considered informal language. So if I were to say something that this was a really cool movie, I'm not talking about the temperature of the movie. I'm talking about the fact that the movie is interesting and engaging. So even though you might have understood what I said, that in this context, cool meant interesting and engaging, best not to use the slang and instead use another word that would be more precise. And again, if you think about something like a second language student learning English, the difficulties in trying to understand that cool means lower temperature, but yet it can also mean in this context that something is interesting and engaging. So the whole idea of avoiding cliches and trite expressions and slang is just to try to universalize a standard form of language, one that's used in education and business, the world of business, so that there is less likely possibility of misunderstanding. And when you're talking about film or you're talking about literature, you use the present, not the past tense. So if you wanted to talk about Norman Bates, you could say that Norman Bates says rather than Norman Bates said, which actually is our transition into Psycho, because Norman Bates is one of the major characters. But before I get to Psycho, you can see that the last part of the handout is about proofreading. And one suggestion for proofreading, if you have difficulty concentrating, read backwards. Read from page 4 to page 1. Obviously, the text won't make a whole lot of sense to you, and that's purposeful so that you can look at things like sentence construction and spelling and grammar. You should have a title, and the title should be original. So if you were going to write a paper about Psycho, you should not call your paper Psycho, because that title is already taken, Alfred Hitchcock's title. Now, you could talk about things like sanity and insanity in Psycho. You can embed part of the title within your own title. And generally speaking, we either underline or italicize the names of films and any longer work, like a book, for instance. And then short stories or shorter episodes are usually put in quotation marks. And if you're reading along with the handout I've included, you can see the age of this handout when it indicates that instructors prefer typewritten papers. This does have to be typed, double space, 1-inch margin, 12-point font, Times or something that's considered to be a standard font. So this is basic formatting. And again, I'm hopeful that this is all review. You should also have a title page, which is a separate sheet that it gives the title of your assignment, your name, my name, the due date, the class. Again, this is all just formatting that I'm hopeful that is just review. But if it's not, and I'm going too quickly, just please let me know, and I'll be happy to go through it with you individually more slowly. And you've got up until the ending of the semester, as I indicated, to do your final project, but the sooner the better. And if you can hand in your final project early enough, there is always the possibility of being able to rewrite the final project for a higher grade. So depends on when you can get that in and what my workload looks like, but that perhaps is some incentive to begin working sooner rather than later. So as I indicated, I still have to talk a little bit about quotation. I thought I would do that next class. Because I wanted you to be able to watch Psycho, and it's an incredibly iconic film, and if nothing else, the music is incredibly iconic, and we've been talking about sound over the course of the semester, where we went from a silent film, Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and what that experience was like, to Dracula, where we have audio, but we don't necessarily have a soundtrack, to where we've got Cat People, where now we've got soundtracks and audio, and the importance of soundtrack and film, all I have to do is, I believe, say, and you probably are thinking shower scene in Psycho. 3 notes. So, and we'll see that with another iconic film as well, with Halloween. That film score has also become very iconic. But I hope you enjoy Psycho, and you can see that I've got the link below for you to be able to access it. And what we'll do is we'll talk a little bit about how Psycho next class is representative of the 1960s. The 1960s was a particularly turbulent decade. There was a lot of political and social and economic uprising. And I think that's seen both in Psycho as well as Night of the Living Dead, which will be the film that follows, that also is representational, I believe, of the 1960s and some of the great turmoil associated with the 60s. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And I thought that for the attendance question, is why do you think the shower scene in Psycho is so iconic? And the shower scene happens to be, if you don't know, without my giving away too many spoilers, when one of the main characters is in the shower and she's attacked. And that's all I'm going to say about that, but you'll be able to identify it soon enough. So enjoy the film, and we will continue on next class, putting whatever closure we need to with Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and then finally moving on to Psycho. Take care. Bye-bye.